Hello, my name is Dupree, and this is my presentation on the efficiency of demand response. Demand response is a short-term voluntary decrease in the electrical consumption by end users. This is generally triggered by compromised grid reliability or high wholesale market prices. And it's important to note that it can be either one. Demand response can be implemented in reaction to grid instability or to high prices. This is the content of the presentation that I'll be going over. Now, the reason why demand response is interesting and worth understanding and potentially implementing is because the burning of fossil fuels for energy is a major contributor to the climate crisis. To mitigate the climate crisis, we have to transition our electrical systems away from fossil fuels and to renewable low carbon sources. That becomes rather hard to do when the demand for energy grows every year, which it is expected to continue to do. The retirement of fossil fuel power plants is hard to justify when demand keeps growing. And the complete decarbonization of the electrical system becomes intractable when we do not have some kind of demand side management. And that's why demand response is rather important, and why a lot of different groups, be it utilities, independent system operators, states, local governments, all are considering creating programs for demand response. This is an overview of how the grid works. On the left here, we have our producers, fossil fuels, renewables. All of these will produce energy. They put energy onto the grid through these transmission lines. Transmission lines are those large, tall, and spanning power lines that you see stretching across the country. They have high voltage, so they can't go directly to the end user because high voltage would break things if it did that. So it goes to transformers, which steps down the voltage of the energy so that it can be distributed safely through distribution lines, which are those poles and wires you see in your local communities. And then that is how energy gets to the end user. This is how energy markets work. You have here labeled A through J, different bids by producers. So this is one producer bidding this much energy, this many megawatts at this price. These bids are determined by the marginal costs facing each producer. So the producers that have the lowest marginal costs will bid the lowest with some markup so they get some profit. And then those that have the highest marginal costs will bid the highest. Anyone with an economics background should see this and start thinking about microeconomic supply curves. You have a schedule of different suppliers who are willing to supply at that given price, and this is essentially the same thing. When we're talking about supply for wholesale energy markets, the demand side is the utility companies. In Massachusetts, that is Eversource, Unitil, and National Grid. They buy up the energy up to the demand intersection, and this demand point is determined by how much energy they expect they will need to supply the end users, like households and firms. When the demand for energy shifts to the right, it is a movement along the supply curve. You will incorporate these higher bids into the supply, and as the energy demand goes down, the lower bidding suppliers are what's necessary to supply demand at that point. And another way in which this works is that the highest priced supplier is the price setter. So all of these bids that cleared the market get paid at the price bid by the highest bidder in the clearing side. So, the lowest marginal cost suppliers will get the highest windfall profits from this event. Now, this is a stylized graph showing how demand changes over the course of a day. So we had the lowest demand before noon and after 8 p.m. When at night or in the early morning, our lights are off, we're not watching television, we're not cooking food, our air conditioning is off. This is when all of our energy intensive activities are not being done, and that's why we have the lowest demand. We go to work, come back from work, the lights go on, the air conditioning goes on, we cook our food, we watch television, we do all of these energy intensive activities, and every household does it all at once. So we have this massive peak in demand, during this peak hours during the day. And we also have peak demands and valleys over the course of a year. The peaks are typically in the summer when we have our air conditioning on, and during the winter, less so because a lot of households rely on burning fossil fuels in their homes, like wood stoves and pellet stoves, stuff like that, for their heating. As we transition away from those sources and to energy-based heating systems like heat pumps and HVAC systems, then we'll start to see a greater peak occurring in winter as well. And we have over the course of the year, demand valleys during spring and autumn, which has the most mild climates. So that is the peaks and valleys. The highest peaks are during these peak hours of day during the summer, and that's when we tend to have the greatest risk of grid instability, and also when we exhaust all of the supply. If you remember back to the supply curve I just showed you, that's when A through J are all clearing the market because demand has shifted all the way to the right. Um, there are power plants that can only supply the grid during these peak periods. These are typically called peaker plants. So most of them are coal and some oil power plants that bid so high that their bids clear the market only when demand peaks during the summer, and they're called peaker power plants. Um, Demand response can lower those peaks and thus reduce the need for those peaker plants to come online. So we cut out the peaking point. Also, we reduce the risk of blackouts, which occur when all of the energy supply is all online, but it's still not enough to supply the demand, and we have blackouts. So we reduce the risk of blackouts, and we can shave the peak, which is a common term used for lowering demand such that those peaker power plants never come online. So there are various methods for demand response. Pictured here is the central heating plant on UMass Amherst's campus that burns liquefied natural gas. So the first method is load curtailment. When the use of the word curtailment is pretty common in the energy system, it generally means reducing some activity. It can refer to reducing supply, so certain power plants coming offline. But in this case, when it is linked with the word load curtailment is when we reduce demand by turning off our devices. So raising the temperature on our climate control systems during the summer, or turning off our lights. These are all examples of load curtailment. Um, and there are several ways in which load curtailment is used. Another method is load shifting. So pictured here is a home battery system. You can charge those batteries at night when the greatest proportion of the energy is coming from renewable sources and when the demand is at its local valley. So we have no risk of grid instability, no risk of those peaker plants coming back online. And then when we charge our batteries at night, we can then draw down from those batteries during the peak hours. By drawing down the battery charge during peak hours, during the peak season, we can lower the demand facing the grid while our own demand remains the same. And that's load shifting. We're taking demand from the peak and putting it in the valley. We're filling the valley and shading the peak at the same time. The next component, the next method is on-site generation. So this is any device that can generate electricity at your home or at your business. So rooftop solar and fossil fuel generators. And all three of these methods can be done at the same time. You can have solar panels, batteries, and load curtailment all happening at once in the same place. So these methods are not mutually exclusive. There are several different types of demand response. The direct load control is a rather important one to understand. This is where some central program operator, usually a utility company or an independent system operator, is given direct control over your smart devices voluntarily. So you surrender that power to them, usually in exchange for some kind of incentive payment. And during those critical peak events where we're approaching, instability, we're seeing higher wholesale market prices, they can remotely shut off your devices, and that will lower demand, avoiding those events. An interruptible load is a contracted, um, uh, demand that will come offline at given points, usually in exchange for a reduced retail power rate or for some kind of energy credit. Uh, when you have a large energy demander, usually some kind of large firm that simultaneously uses a lot of energy, but also doesn't have the need for uninterrupted demand or uninterrupted energy supply, if they can afford to have their energy go offline for a few hours for 15 days of the summer, they can save a lot of money by having a reduced rate on their energy, and that's usually how interruptible loads work. Critical peak pricing with load control is the exact same thing as the direct load control I mentioned earlier, but in addition, we have a predetermined spike in the wholesale price when we're approaching some kind of critical event. So we immediately raise the price during those critical events to hopefully counteract demand. A spinning reserve is some kind of reserve power supply that can come online to the grid to supply the peak within 10 minutes of the critical event. Usually this requires it to not be preloaded, and it must be in synchrony with the grid so that it can supply immediately. A non-spinning reserve may be loaded and isn't synchronized, so it takes at least 10 minutes to come online and supply the grid during those peak periods. And that 10-minute differential is a FERC definition. There are a variety of benefits for demand response. The major one I'll highlight is the avoiding of environmental compliance costs and avoided externalities from peaker plants. If we can avoid peaker plants coming online, not only do we avoid the health impacts from fine particulate matter, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, those emissions will go down because we don't have peaker plants coming online, but also greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced because those power plants don't come online. So those are some benefits of demand response. Also, we avoid capacity costs. A capacity cost is a charge on your electricity bill that ensures that you will be supplied power even when we are in times of peak instability. If you do not pay that charge on your electricity bill, then it's likely that your household will be the first to lose power in some kind of critical grid emergency. We also avoid the costs of building new transmission and distribution lines. Uh, with high demand peaks, the grid and supply has to be built out to supply that peak because blackouts are unacceptable. So when we project super high peaks, the grid operator, along with the utility companies, have to build more transmission lines and distribution lines. And if we're projecting a lower peak due to demand response, then we don't need to build those transmission lines and distribution lines. So we avoid those costs. And we also avoid ancillary services as well, which are activities that are bought and sold in ancillary service markets that stabilize the grid, like spinning reserves are an ancillary service. Black start services, which is the ability to restart the grid without some external energy source. So these are ancillary services that we don't need to purchase if we avoid grid instability through demand response. And then reduce electricity costs. This is a significant one and one worth noting. If we can shave demand, then the price facing all rate-paying consumers goes down. This can introduce some kind of risk of free loading, where we have a handful of households and businesses participating in a demand response program, shaving the peak and avoiding huge spikes in the wholesale price, but the retail price that is facing all ratepayers goes down as a result, and people will benefit even though they don't participate in demand response. Also, this is reduced price volatility in wholesale markets and improved reliability as well. A major cost of demand response is the loss of services. So the specific service I'm referring to, there's a wide variety of them, but in cases of controllable loads, where the utility company can remotely shut off your devices, you lose out on those services that those devices give you. For instance, your smart thermostat is controlling the climate in your home. It's lowering the temperature to keep you comfortable. When the utility company shuts it off remotely, your house will become much hotter, uncomfortably hot, or even dangerously hot. That is a harm done to you, and that is usually why incentive payments are necessary to induce participation because of the loss of these services. It's also a major reason why people are unwilling to participate in demand response, and why you also see a free rider problem where a household can free ride on some other participant's demand response while not losing those services. The operating costs for the program, uh, whoever's operating the demand response program centrally needs to monitor the grid and communicate with devices and pay workers, and all of that is the operating cost of the program. There's also the cost of smart devices themselves. Your smart thermostat came with a cost. The batteries came with a cost. Your rooftop solar came with a cost. That's also another cost of facilitating a demand response. Not every household has those equipment, and if you want to build out a greater demand response pool of participants, you need to pay that equipment cost. There's also a reduced profit to utilities because they sell a smaller volume of energy. Their markup on energy is reduced because they're selling less megawatts. But then again, on the other side, we have greater grid reliability and less stress, lower maintenance costs on the grid. So there is a plus side on the other end for the same utility companies. Now, these last two I want to highlight. Um, you have environmental externalities that occur if fossil fuel generators are used to supplement your demand for on-site generation only. Those are not costs on the cost side of demand response if those fossil fuel generators aren't being used, or if batteries are used in their place. Now, most of those benefits and costs are transacted in markets, like the costs of new transmission lines, the capacity costs on your energy bills. All of those have a price. They all have markets. The value of lost services, in some sense, has a market because there's an incentive payment in most of those cases. So that's the willingness to accept the value of those lost services. The environmental externalities are important to calculate as well. The value of statistical life is important when we're measuring the costs, the damages of air pollution that are produced by peaker plants, produced by fossil fuel generators, um, and also estimating the costs of climate change as well is an important part of it. Um, the the last part, risk of grid instability, is an interesting one to measure. So one way it can be measured is replacement costs methods. So we would basically find out how much more supply of energy, how much more transmission lines are necessary to create the same stability that we would expect resulting from a demand response. It's important to avoid double counting. If you're counting the reduced cost of transmission build out as on the benefit side, then you can't double count that with the reduced risk because you're kind of counting it twice in that case. So it's important to be careful of that. And there's also a defensive expenditure option as well. Um, I'm less in favor of this method. So there are defensive expenditures for grid instability. Households buy batteries. They buy on-site generators like a fossil fuel generator to defend themselves from the risk of a blackout. Um, I find that a little bit less effective of a method for measuring it. Not all households do it, not all households can afford it, and not all households expect grid instability until it happens. So I have a few recommendations. The main one is incorporating demand response into the broader portfolio of policies to accomplish the renewable energy transition. There is a few options for discouraging free riding. Mass CEC is funded in large part by a surcharge on energy bills. You can raise that bill for anyone who doesn't report participating in a demand response program, and that way you can fund the Mass CEC more so and also encourage participating in demand response and avoid free riding. Also, it's worth uh, making sure that the incentive payments, um, what are they accounting for? The incentive payments are transacting for the loss of those services that you get from your smart devices. It's not in every case that they're going to in any way price environmental externalities because that's not relevant to the cost benefits of utilities. So um, a state like Massachusetts might be able to have its own system of rewarding participation for demand response equal to the environmental externalities avoided by participation. So that might be another policy worth considering. And then there's the classic state activities like providing public information, There are already Massachusetts.gov websites that um, you know, collect all of the available information of the various demand response programs available in Massachusetts. Supporting renewable projects and research is a great one. And then also, it's important that the state finds a way to transition and retire peaker plants. So, how do we convert peaker plants so that we get as much value out of them after they're no longer used for supplying the peak? One option is surplus interconnection service, where you can use the interconnection agreement that peaker plants have to interconnect some other new program like a virtual power plant or some other kind of renewable power plant. And these are all the policies that a state like Massachusetts could do to better demand response within the state. In conclusion, there is an opportunity for greater economic efficiency due to demand response, though it all depends on the specific implementation, the methods used, the techniques used, and also there's a room for public policy to make that efficiency happen more.